Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started. Hey everyone, I'm your host, Joanna, and welcome back to Work in Progress. Today, we're going to be chatting about self-care for ADHD, and we will look at strategies for managing stress and burnout. I'd love to welcome our guest, Dan Van der Pluym. Dan is a psychosocial mental health and ADHD coach, specializing in helping individuals who struggle with maintaining stability and working towards important goals. Hi, Dan. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on the show. First, I'd love if you could tell us a bit more about yourself and who you are.
Sure. So I'm a psychotherapist and a coach. As you mentioned, I specialize in working with people that have ADHD and other mental health challenges. Part of my own personal lived experience journey is that over a year ago, I was actually diagnosed with ADHD, gone through various challenges and struggles associated with that in my own life, my own journey, and also had a range of successes and triumphs. And it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride personally, but finding stability and balance across different areas of life has been really important for me to manage. And it's guided me in my own personal journey to helping others in these areas.
Yeah, amazing. And I've noticed that ADHD has become such a hot topic, especially in Australia. And I know that it's hard to get assessed for ADHD. There's long wait times, it's expensive. Tell me a bit more about that and why it's become such a huge thing.
Yeah, look, I think previously there was a lack of public awareness and perhaps some very limited ideas of what ADHD actually is and how it presents. So a lot of people in the past thought that ADHD, and probably still think that ADHD is just purely about inattention, difficulty focusing and behaving badly. But it's so much more than that. For a lot of people, it presents in a whole range of areas across life.
Yeah.
Everything from, managing emotions, difficulty with emotion regulation, difficulties with high levels of stress, finding problems with communication, difficulties in relationships, negative self-belief. And people thought it might have been depression, anxiety, mood disorders, other personality disorders, and it's actually becoming more apparent as all these other things that people experience are actually part of ADHD.
Yeah.
So it's a mood dysregulation or emotional dysregulation disorder, an attentional disorder, and perhaps even moving away from the word disorder, it's just the way that people are uniquely wired a bit differently from others that make it difficult to address and attend to different life areas in the ways that neurotypical people might.
Yeah, and I know ADHD is more common than we think. I think I remember reading a stat that 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 Australians have ADHD. I think it was 1 in 10 maybe.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a kind of idea that it could be 5% of the population, and perhaps it's a bit more. We're getting a lot more cases coming through due to the increased awareness. So the actual prevalence rates, depending on which area of society you look at, can range quite a bit. But generally speaking, I think it's sort of around the 5 to 6% of the population that, becoming diagnosed. That may increase over time. So, increased public awareness. The challenge as well with those wait times to get the diagnosis means that there's a big backlog to get through. And that could be really challenging because once people receive this diagnosis, there's a lot more understanding about why they've had certain challenges in life. It's very affirming for a lot of people that receive it. So, yeah.
And I know there's lots of quizzes out there where you can sort of take a quiz and see if you've got ADHD and people self-diagnosing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think some of the quizzes can be accurate. Look, they might be a positive initial way for people to gain awareness about why they're having certain experiences.
Yeah.
Some of the quizzes are probably a bit more accurate in terms of clinically accurate assessing and I guess kind of tracking the right kinds of data.
Yeah.
But some of the quizzes may not be.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be careful with pre-diagnosis. And just ensure that we actually follow the process to getting a formal diagnosis, because some of that data may not be capturing, ADHD accurately.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I can't wait to dive into that a bit more. But first, we have a section called Have You Met Dan? So here we just get to know you with some little get to know you questions. So my first question for you is, what is your favorite book, or do you have one?
Well, several books
Yeah.
have been a key part of my own personal development journey. I guess over time, I've always been very curious about my own experience of life, trying to understand myself from a very young age as a teenager,
Yeah.
trying to make sense of the world around me. So as part of that, I was reading quite a bit, even in my earlier 20s, around personal development, spirituality as well.
Yeah.
I remember when I was quite young, I read a book called Conversations with God, which was about spirituality and the higher power, higher self. I found that really kind of intriguing, interesting. Then I read a number of books around meditation and mindfulness. I was very much into that, from my 20s onwards, and found that to be a very helpful tool. I've come across a range of books around trauma. One book in particular, The Body Keeps the Score, taught me a lot about people's traumatic response patterns and how to understand trauma, which is really interesting from an ADHD perspective. And that's actually been almost a big kind of understanding around how to work with people that have certain traumatic experiences, and how the neuroplasticity of the brain and the nervous system actually create response patterns. And this is why people behave in certain ways. And when you combine that with ADHD, it's just interesting to see that there's often real common themes and similarities in people's lives. So that book was very instrumental. Apart from that, I'm very interested in, I guess, some poetic work around understanding the meaning of life. I'm currently reading one called Alan Watts called This Is It, which is really interesting. It's about enlightenment and the path of life. Another one, late author Khalil Gibran, called The Prophet, was quite instrumental in understanding different conditions of life, social circumstances, and creating a deep philosophical understanding of this journey. So a number of those things. And a really good book on ADHD that I'm currently embarking on at the moment is called The Year That I Met My Brain. And that has been really powerful in understanding how ADHD presents for adults and how the diagnosis can really help an adult understand so many life circumstances, provides a different lens and context and deep realization about how the diagnosis, but also the themes around diagnosis, the narrative, really helped this lady understand her life from a different perspective, and a lot of self-compassion and care coming through that realization. So,
wow, some profound selections there.
Definitely.
And do you find that meditation and mindfulness is something that can be really useful for people with ADHD?
Absolutely. In my own journey, found meditation and mindfulness very helpful. With ADHD, the threat response centers of the brain are very overactive and very sensitive. And through practices that help regulate that threat response pattern, we're able to de-escalate the responses so that we can operate more clearly, think more clearly. Executive functioning is improved through that. However, people with ADHD often need very different form of mindfulness. So the more passive traditional forms of mindfulness and meditation don't necessarily work, because the racing mind loves activity. And when you take activity away, when you completely take reward away from that racing mind, it almost creates more kind of dysregulation. So people with ADHD often need moving forms of mindfulness and meditation, active mindfulness and things like that, which have been really helpful in my own journey. So I enjoy everything from, being out in nature, walking mindfully, to, watching the ocean, or, listening to certain sounds that are part of sensory soothing activities.
Yeah.
So I find that really helpful.
Amazing. Well, hopefully we can dive into that as
Yeah.
strategy for
Sure.
dealing with this a bit later as well. But I've got a couple more questions here. And my next one is there a movie that you've recently enjoyed or one you can recommend to us?
That's a good question. Movie I recently watched, I can't say enjoyed,
That's okay.
but I would say it was very, a bit disturbing.
Mm.
What was it called? I'm trying to think.
What's it about?
It's about a guy who falls into this obsessive kind of relationship with this woman. She walks into where he works. He works at a pub in the UK, and he's harassed by this woman for months repeatedly. We understand why he was in this situation with her. So it's like a trauma bond kind of thing.
Oh, is it Lover, Stalker, Killer?
No. What is it? What did it come up? Baby Reindeer.
I was just going to say, I'm looking at that one.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I've definitely seen that one around.
Yeah.
Interesting. So is that like a movie?
Well, it's a series. It's a mini series on Netflix.
Oh, okay.
It's called Baby Reindeer. So I wouldn't say it was the best film or series that I've watched, but it was very moving in its own way, very troubling, very disturbing, but a real understanding of trauma bonds, the human psyche, how people become attached to certain circumstances in life based on past pain and struggle, how people become obsessed and fixated on other people, and just how different attachment dynamics play out as a part of people meeting unmet needs through attaching themselves to things that are harmful and damaging and dangerous based on the life narrative. It's very relatable in terms of people that have ADHD or even have mental health challenges, feeling not good enough, feeling insignificant, struggling with their self-worth, then often hooking into situations that give them a false sense of validation, or perhaps even an unhealthy sense of validation. And these, fixated, addictive patterns of behavior become a way of meeting the unmet needs around feeling, insignificant or being unseen, low self-worth and low self-belief. And it's just quite amazing and interesting how these patterns form. And that was actually based on a true story where this man was stalked and harassed for months by a woman. Both people were desperately lonely and in a sense relied on each other to actually find, some form of meaning in their lives, to feel important enough to somebody else. Really quite sad.
Oh, wow.
But it's really blown up in the media. And she's gone on, I think Conan O'Brien actually done an interview about the whole situation. So there's a lot of, I guess, discrepancy around the truth, his truth, and what she's saying is the truth. A bit of a mismatch. But apparently she did get in trouble with the law. She went to prison for stalking, apparently, in the show. So
that's really interesting.
It was, so disturbing, but really interesting. Yeah.
And I find that, think terms like trauma bonds it's very present in the media and on social media as well. And I think it's so important to be able to see what those types of things look like or what they actually mean, because we use those words so casually sometimes, like ADHD as well. So it's really important to spread awareness around that. So I'll definitely be checking that out. That sounds really interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah, great. Well, I also wanted to ask you if you're listening to any podcasts at the moment.
Podcasts, I listen to a few around, I guess, understanding the human psyche, personal development, personal growth. There's a couple of podcasts around ADHD Explained. There's another one for entrepreneurs with ADHD that I listen to quite regularly. So a few of those. I tune in and out, and my attention span's a bit limited. When I'm driving, I often listen to podcasts, then I'll tune out, then I'll put music on and go back to it. So, I work in those bursts. There's certain days where I absorb the information, and then other days where it just kind of goes right over my head. And
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
extra mental work, but I do enjoy podcasts and absolutely like expanding my ideas and understandings and realizations about the world and people.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like sometimes podcasts can be a really great thing to just have in the background, even if you're not really listening.
Yep.
Or sometimes like you're actually invested in an episode and you learn so much, which is really great.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, I've got one last question here for you, which is, do you have a role model?
It's a good question. Role models growing up. I guess I always idolized people who were humble, but also able to make a positive difference, selflessness. So, I think about people like Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, and those types who really sacrificed themselves in a sense, but also for the greater good, stood for their values. I think about integrity, really exemplifying that through being true to their word, not being compromised by other forms of pressure or oppression. So I think those types of people always stand out for me. Thinking about people who have overcome adversity in life. I mean, my parents, ancestors as well, overcame a lot of adversity, a lot of struggle, resilience, and the ability to move forward and still find meaning and purpose and kind of not give up when things got tough.
Yeah, perfect. And I feel like that's so important to have people around you as well, but also like we look up to famous people and people who are making real change in the world, which is great. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think we can dive into the nitty-gritty for today. So I'd love to start off by asking you what ADHD is, because I feel like we all have this idea of what it is, but I feel like there's a bit more to it.
Yep. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition. There's genetic, biological links, and it's basically a deficiency in neurochemicals and brain structural elements that prevent a person from engaging in executive functioning, paying attention, and engage in impulsivity and hyperactive behaviors.
Yeah.
Essentially, a big part of it is emotion regulation or emotion dysregulation, because the parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and other areas of the brain that are deficient in neurochemicals such as dopamine and norepinephrine, they're not only responsible for applying ourselves to goal-directed behaviors or applying our attention to what we want to achieve, perhaps linear thinking or executive functioning, but they're also responsible for planning our emotional responses and reactions to life circumstances. And quite commonly, part of hyperactivity, or the impulsive part, is jumping in to reactive behaviors based on hardwired emotional patterns, meaning that a person, when experiencing a difficult emotion, will short fire that emotion into behavior before it reaches the logical processing part of the brain to actually make a clear decision about how to work with that emotion before reacting in it.
Interesting. Yeah. And is ADHD something that people are born with, or can they develop it over time? Because there are people who get diagnosed with ADHD when they're in their teens or, later in life.
This is an interesting question, and it's very controversial.
Yeah.
From the research that I've come across, there's a lot of mixed ideas and understandings. I believe from this research, people are born with ADHD as a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's often passed through genetically, the bloodline. It's biological. However, life circumstances, external factors, bring the characteristics to life.
Okay.
So people have this kind of neurodevelopmental predisposition, but particularly in early years of life, the brain, the nervous system is so malleable that circumstances around the individual really bring out the characteristics throughout life.
Yeah.
And because those circumstances bring out the characteristics, people engage or learn to engage with their external environments in a way that's probably somewhat adaptive, but then becomes dysfunctional. For example, a person that's born into a certain environment where there's overstimulation, the nervous system is quite hijacked. They're constantly scanning their environments for threat. They're shifting their attention very rapidly.
Yeah.
They're emotionally potentially quite reactive.
Yeah.
And those patterns of behaviors become hardwired. However, the person born with the predisposition is very much more likely to be highly sensitive to their environments.
Yeah.
So I hope that explains.
Yeah, no, that definitely does. And I think it's really interesting because I thought ADHD for someone who gets diagnosed later in their life is something that they have just developed. But it's interesting to know that, well, according to the research, that most people actually are born with it. And so are you saying that through the environment that you're exposed to and over time, like it's a developmental thing, like you develop it over time as well?
I would say the characteristics become more pronounced through environmental circumstances and stresses.
Yeah.
An interesting thing is perhaps looking at circumstances in the world over the last 3 to 4 years. We've had COVID restriction, people going back into work. We've had a disruption to the outlets, the positive social outlets that people would rely upon to have their reward systems met with, healthy levels of stimulation, environmental stimulation to keep people focused and engaged with life.
Yeah.
When these things are taken away, it's not that ADHD is created through those circumstances. The ADHD was sitting there, was lying dormant, but people rely on so many external factors to almost mask the ADHD. They lost the ability to mask it, and then it became more pronounced. So masking is another thing. The ADHD might be there, and people find ways around it before even knowing that it's ADHD. They just find ways to engage with life.
Yeah.
They may even feel a lack of belonging or that they're wired a bit differently. They may not be able to put the terminology to being wired differently, but they just feel different to others. We all want to fit in, particularly from an early age. We all want to belong to our environments.
Yeah.
When we don't belong to those environments, we try harder to fit in, or perhaps we isolate ourselves.
Yeah.
And through trying to fit in or isolating oneself, there's a lot of internalized stress and pressure that becomes almost like a form of high-functioning anxiety later in life. So people rely on that stress or pressure to guide their behaviors to meet the challenges of life in the world. And this is where so many people with ADHD in earlier life have had diagnoses of anxiety, depression, mood disorders, and so forth, because they've been using that way of coping to almost mask the symptoms or the characteristics to feel like they're like everyone else.
Yeah. And how do stressful situations impact an individual with ADHD?
Yep. So the stress receptors in the brain and the nervous system hijack a person's ability to engage in executive functioning, to be able to plan, map tasks out, to think ahead, to think clearly, to focus on one thing at a time.
Yeah.
And it can create a lot of internal chaos, and then that becomes behavioral chaos. However, also the ADHD brain is quite responsive to threat or stressful circumstances where we actually work well under tight deadlines. We operate well under chaos when there's a lot going on around us. We actually operate quite calmly and apply our focus because we're almost reliant on stress to operate the executive functioning areas of the brain operate more effectively under that level of stress and stimulation. So it works in a couple of ways. Stress can be really debilitating for people with ADHD, but often also respond really well under stressful circumstances. But then because there's an over-reliance on stress, it's likely to result in eventual burnout. So when the stress is there, that person's engaged, they're focused, they're able to make good decisions, they're operating in this kind of high-performance mode because the brain's getting the level of stimulation it needs to operate constructively. But then when that stress is reduced or removed, they often crash and fall into a heap.
Yeah. So in terms of the emotions that might arise in this situation, are there a variety of emotions that people might experience?
I think the primary emotion in those types of stressful situations are resulting around like fear, panic.
Yeah.
Perhaps not even as much panic, but maybe a fear-based response.
Yeah.
Apart from fear, what's underneath there? Maybe there's frustration, a lot of angst. Perhaps underneath that, there might be some sadness about the fact that they've had so many struggles and they have to rely on such a high level of stimulation and stress to get through life. And it's such a roller coaster that it takes so much out of people. They end up extremely exhausted, burnt out, drained, and falling into a heap. So,
Yeah. And would there be like negative emotions, kind of like guilt surrounding that for people who constantly have to go through that and feel that way and feel like they have to make themselves feel bad about being that way?
Absolutely. People with ADHD commonly operate with a really strong self-critical inner dialogue.
Yeah.
And that's due to internalizing a lot of criticism throughout life about not keeping up or missing things. So they use that fear to drive them to be good enough. But underlying that fear, there is a lot of shame and guilt about past mistakes, situations that didn't work out, feeling different to other people.
Yeah.
An internalization of that shame and guilt, when that's running the show, then creates fear around, I don't want to be shamed again. I don't want to miss another important deadline. I don't want to fail at something. I need to be really focused and consistent, and using fear as a driving force to do that.
Yeah. And how can people with ADHD deal with these sort of emotions when they arise in these situations?
I think it's important just to know what's running the show. What is the driving force here?
Yeah.
To be able to recognize the emotion in its early stages and finding a way to know how that feels in the mind, know how it feels in the body. When that fear starts rising, even when there's shame underneath, the self-compassionate inner voice, strengthening the supportive inner dialogue to recognize, okay, I do have challenges and there are past failures, but I am good enough and I can do this.
Yeah.
That sort of encouraging part and strengthening that part through a lot of work. That's what a lot of what I do in therapy and coaching is strengthening positive inner dialogue to really counteract the shame and guilt that people have associated with past failures. Another part that I really utilize is being able to recognize early stages of angst and fear, and rather than running from it or pushing it away, just being able to almost mobilize it. Okay, you've got this energy there. It's a bit of anxiety. It's a bit of fear. It's not the enemy. If you develop a healthy relationship to it, you can actually use it as a driving force to perform.
Yeah.
But you also need to know how to put a bit of a container on it or limit its impact. You don't want to get to the point where you're just overcompensating and taking on too much from all directions because you're fearful of not being enough or not doing enough.
Yeah.
You actually want to be able to regulate the fear response. So you say, okay, I recognize this fear is here and it's can be utilized as a positive driving force into action, but I'm not going to take on 20 pieces of work today because it's just not viable. And eventually I'm going to fall into a heap and crash and burn and not achieve any of them effectively. So I'm better off limiting the amount I take on, but also noticing, okay, there's a healthy level of stress here that I can manage.
Yeah. And when you mention like self-compassion, it kind of links really well to self-care. So what does self-care mean in the context of people with ADHD?
Self-care can be a lot of things for people with ADHD, and often it results in a level of activity that provides some enjoyment, some reward.
Yeah.
So it's not just sitting in silence for an hour in a dark room because there's a racing mind and lots of thoughts jumping around.
Yeah.
I think self-care can be anything from being out in nature. It can be just simply doing a little bit of writing and journaling about thoughts and feelings. It can be going out and interacting with friends in a healthy social environment, provided we're not socially burnt out.
Yeah.
Sometimes just doing something that's self-nurturing and comforting. It could be just jumping in front of the TV and putting on some binge Netflix episodes to, take ourselves on a bit of a mental journey away from what we're going through. That's okay. I think it's good to have a range of things in the toolkit, but not to overburden ourselves with forcing ourselves into what we think self-care is or what it should be.
Yeah, definitely. Because I feel like there can be this sort of predisposed idea of what self care is, like
Mm.
meditation and all that kind of stuff. And we'll try to do all those things,
Yep.
and sometimes they just don't work for us.
Mm.
I also wanted to ask you of the importance of self care, especially for people who have just been diagnosed with ADHD
Mm.
and they're like, going through this for the first time with that awareness.
Yeah. I think for people that have just been diagnosed with ADHD, it's really important for them to know what their body and mind needs. There's a lot
Yeah.
of restlessness.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of understanding, okay, these are my life circumstances and these are the things that have played out and this is why it's played out. So with that realization, so there's often a lot of sadness too.
Yeah.
People often regret that they weren't diagnosed earlier in life.
Mm.
So I think just taking the time to piece it all together,
Yeah.
taking the time to maybe do some reflection, some journaling, taking the time to really understand that they're not a bad person. They're not a failure. There's reasons why they've struggled. And the
Yeah.
environments around them may not have had the capacity to meet their needs as unique people in this world.
Yeah, definitely. And what are some other sort of misconceptions that exist surrounding ADHD?
A couple that I can come up with are people with ADHD are not intelligent.
Yeah.
That's untrue. People with ADHD are some of the most intelligent people in the world. Divergent thinking means we're often able to create unique solutions to problems,
Yeah.
very creative, and the kind of overactive, over-creative mind can find a lot of new breakthroughs and innovations. A lot of the most famous and successful people who have had real unique talents and skill sets have done so because their brains are wired differently. They
Yeah.
think differently. They engage with the world differently, and that can be a gift.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of like embracing ADHD, especially if you've just been diagnosed with it, what's the best way to induce more positive self-talk?
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing is acknowledging limitations,
Yeah.
being okay with limitations, and acknowledging why we've had certain limitations in certain environments. My brain and my nervous system weren't designed to sit in a classroom for 6-7 hours a day,
Yeah.
sitting still, not making noise.
Yeah.
I needed to be more active. I needed to let that energy flow through my body and through my mind. The restlessness was too contained. And as a result, I acted out in class.
Yeah.
So just those realizations, understanding that, the environments that we've been engaging with weren't really designed to suit our needs. And perhaps
Yeah.
then understanding, well, I have unique needs and I'm not a bad person for being different. I'm not a bad person for having these unique needs.
Yeah.
I need environments that support those needs, that support me to thrive. And I can thrive when my unique needs, my learning style, and the way that I'm wired, when that's tapped into, and my special interests
Yeah.
are tapped into, then I can thrive.
Yeah. And how can we as a society, develop more awareness for this as well?
I think channeling people into different streamlined areas that
Yeah.
are associated with their strengths, fine-tuning and endorsing strengths. I think there's a lot of really skilled educators out there who are really able to tap into unique learning styles in classrooms and other environments and other areas of life
Yeah.
by measuring intelligence in multiple ways, not just looking at it as rote learning intelligence or book learning intelligence. There's so many different forms. There's creative forms of intelligence. There's intelligence through play-based behaviors. There's intelligence through experimentation of new ideas and innovations. There's creative thinkers that are highly intelligent. I think the more broader we understand intelligence, the more opportunity we have to embrace neurodiversity.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'd love to move into our practices and habits. So here, I'd love to ask if you have a practice that you use to manage stress or burnout personally.
Yeah, personally, look, it's changed over time.
Yeah.
As my needs change, I think I'm very much affected by seasons as well and
Yeah.
the climate.
Yeah.
I know that in certain times of the year, it helps to do really strong, powerful kind of exercise, movement, weight training.
Yeah.
I was going through a period of time where I was utilizing ice baths, 5-minute ice baths, and
Yeah.
training, doing resistance training quite regularly.
Mm.
after a period of doing that, I realized that my energy needs changed a little bit and I need to do things that are a bit more sort of gentle and passive for my body and mind. So that worked for a period of time. Then being able to adapt that. So, I'm sort of more interested in taking on some breathing meditation, yoga, active mindful walking, a bit of hiking, things that may not involve as kind of intense physical action, but regenerate my nervous system a little bit better. I think one of the most important things is knowing how beneficial physical activity is, any form of physical activity for ADHD, because of the restlessness, the mind and body love to move.
Yeah.
So whilst getting started can be difficult, there's the early stages of feeling a bit sluggish and taking that first step, knowing what's accessible. So if joining a gym and going to a gym every morning are not so accessible because it takes 2 hours out of my day, being able to at least just get up and going for a walk, start by doing something simple and accessible and building from that. So we look at incremental habit change and how those habits can support our well-being, and it's extremely essential to start the day with something that gives us a sense of positivity to build towards the next thing.
Yeah. And how do we get more in line with sort of what our body is telling us? Like you mentioned, sometimes you need something that's a bit more high energy, or sometimes you need something a bit more passive. So how do we get in tune with that?
For me personally, I think journaling. If it's not journaling, just doing daily check-ins with myself. Like how am I actually feeling? What am I noticing about my energy levels? What times of the day are my energy levels at their peak? What times of the day do I really crash? Knowing what we need at those different times through attuning to ourselves. The ADHD mind often races around looking for external stimulation, distraction, and to be effective across different life areas. So coming back to the self and our own needs becomes really important, knowing physiologically what we actually need based on this sort of checking in and attuning to that.
Yeah. And what are some other challenges that might arise when we're trying to check in with ourselves and, determine what we actually need?
With some of the challenges associated with checking in, often when the mind and body are racing, when we're really hyper-focused or when we're kind of in a state of burning out or in a kind of highly stressed state, we often run from ourselves. Go into a bit of maybe a flight mode response pattern where the attention is drifting around in all directions, and it's very hard at that point to sit with really uncomfortable thoughts and feelings that come up. So it's really important to be able to stabilize and have a stable routine and do what we can to stabilize our moods to make checking in a bit easier so we don't have to sort of run from ourselves.
Yeah. And how do you think implementing these sort of check-ins in your life has, improved or impacted your sense of productivity?
Well, it really helps because I don't get derailed by mood fluctuations as easily. I know there will be fluctuations in my mood and energy levels, but I can plan around them. And I still have basic systems and structures that support me to be productive, even with those fluctuations. It's about making the things that we want to achieve a bit easier for us when we're feeling flat and low or when we don't have as much energy. And when we have more energy, knowing that we can channel that into thriving, but also setting healthy limitations on, all right, I've got a lot of energy to focus right now. I can get heaps done. But at a point, if I'm too optimistic about that, I know that I'll eventually crash and burn out. So just being able to put some healthy limitations on productivity, being productive, but also knowing where the limit is, and at the same time being able to then rest effectively, recover, and sleep is really vital and important. So consistent sleep routine.
Yeah, definitely. And have you found that a routine or like scheduling things into your day helps, or does that make things more challenging?
It's interesting because on one hand, we do need structure. Structure and scheduling keeps us on track. And without those things become chaotic, messy, all over the place. So we absolutely do need that. But we also thrive in novelty. So when we're talking about consistency, I think it's important to balance the need for structure with the need to take on new things. Obviously, the structure allows space for flexibility. That's the way I like to look at it. That structure isn't designed to keep us rigid and repetitive. It's designed to put the basic grounding in place so that we can actually take on new things, but, in a calculated, careful way, not jumping into things sporadically. We were able to actually make informed decisions because we've got the structure that creates a space in our mental energy to make those decisions.
Yeah. And it really sounds like finding what's best for you as, an individual with ADHD comes with a bit of trial and error and actually taking time to figure out what works for you as opposed to a one size fits all.
Yes, absolutely. Look, with ADHD, it's so different for everybody.
Yeah.
I know people that sleep really well.
Mm-hmm.
Other people don't sleep that well. I know people who are morning people. They've got lots of energy bursting in the mornings. Some people, they just can't get out of bed.
Yeah.
We're all a bit different. But the common thing is that we do need some sorts of systems and structures. But whatever works for each individual is based on the individual's predispositions, their energy levels, their life circumstances. A lot of people I work with have families that they have to respond to.
Yeah.
Children and competing work demands and pressures, and some people don't. So structure and the kinds of habits that keep people on track, keep people balanced and regulated, really kind of vary depending on person's life circumstances, external factors, and also their internal biological factors in association with ADHD.
Yeah. And how can we, use this, our community and our friends and family to help us through this, especially if our friends or our family don't have ADHD and can't really relate in that sense?
It's a great question because people with ADHD have often struggled with the lack of belonging and disconnection because they're wired differently. However, through educating and informing people in the broader community about how ADHD presents, how it impacts the individual, then we can also provide guidance on how to work with that individual to complement them. And I think about how we can create synergies in work environments, family environments, and other areas of life to allow that person to flourish and also to give that person the support they need when they're struggling, how to be that sort of pillar that person needs. At the same time, I think it's really important for that person to be connected to people because people give us often the greatest sense of purpose in our life. I mean, I'm guided by my work with people. If it wasn't for the people that I care about that are around me and people that care about me, I wouldn't have as much meaning in the direction of my life. So there's a really important piece around, even with productivity, having a buddy to work alongside. So we call it body doubling.
Yeah.
So having someone to work alongside, you don't even have to be talking the whole time. You can just work on your own stuff. But having that companionship next to you to know that you're not alone working on this, there's a real comfort element, self-soothing element to that. So connection is extremely important for a lot of people with ADHD and also feeling understood.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us and some strategies as well that we can use. I'd love to jump into our open mic section now. So
Awesome.
Here, I'll just hand it over to you. As you know, this is a space where you can talk about anything you'd like to.
Yeah. So look, I'm guided by my own personal journey. Since I was a kid, I was trying to understand myself and the world and why things are the way they are.
Yeah.
Trying to comprehend, why people interact and behave in certain ways, why things impact me. It's always been an ongoing process of personal development. As a teenager, growing up in life, I didn't know I had ADHD. I didn't know why I was operating certain ways in certain environments or why I had certain challenges and why I had certain interests. But through my own process of self-realization, through the work that I've done over many years, and the work continues on my own personal development, and through my diagnosis of ADHD, I've come to understand myself and also understand why people are the way they are around me too. Alongside that, I've been fortunate enough to study and work in an area that I've been passionate about since I was young. This is my life purpose. This is my life journey. And I'm thankful that I've been able to find that, because having that clear direction allows me to give back. And obviously I'm continually, learning new skills and developing my ability professionally and personally to offer value to the people I work with, but also to offer support and offer an ear to listen to people who have these challenges so they feel connected to, so they feel heard and validated. And being able to do that then allows a relationship, professional, personal relationship to build to help people flourish. So if you're struggling with ADHD, it can be really helpful to get a diagnosis.
Yeah.
If you think you might have ADHD, or if you experience some of the challenges that I've spoken about today, it can be helpful to look into it, to start that journey and seek support. So I operate my business, Deeper Potential Coaching. That's been running for about 3 to 4 years now.
Yeah.
ADHD has been a big focus of that business. I've also built another program for entrepreneurs like myself, small business owners,
Yeah.
solopreneurs who have ADHD. We often struggle to tap into our strengths because we try to do all things in all areas of our businesses.
Yeah.
We overcompensate and we burn out. We become exhausted. It's hard to manage. So this program that I've built, Team ADHD, is for small business owners who are looking to streamline into their strengths, optimize their working habits, and reach their important business goals more efficiently, giving them time and energy back. So it's a huge part of my journey, and it's a work in progress for me. And I want to help people on that journey. So it's a group program that I've formed. And I'm really excited. It's a really instrumental part of my own journey. So there's that. And also group programs that I've also been involved with to help people with ADHD in this area of negative self-belief or sensitivity to rejection.
Yeah.
So that's another program that I've collaborated with a business partner in, and absolutely looking at rolling more of these group programs out in the future and scaling my business. We do some workplace consultations for people who are neurodivergent, who may not be aware of it or who might be, understanding their working styles, their tendencies, their needs. And that's an educational piece across a whole company or organization to help work with that individual or those individuals more effectively.
Yeah, great. Well, that sounds really great.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you've found like your purpose and your life purpose. And for people who have ADHD, how can they go about doing that for themselves, especially when they're navigating something new, especially if they've just been diagnosed with ADHD?
Yep. I think one of the most important questions I've asked people is, what is it that you do that feels good for you? What is it in your childhood that you've really enjoyed? What gave you a sense of interest, passion? What lit you up? And how can you tap into that?
Yeah.
And what decisions, what things do you need to implement, put in place to tap into your passion and what you really want to be in this world?
Yeah.
And let's actually make that happen. And let's look at what you need to make that happen.
Yeah.
And let's look at working on the obstacles and the barriers, the limiting beliefs, the emotional blockages, and also the strategic steps, the behavioral steps that you can take to actually tap into what fuels your passion, what aligns with your values as well, what aligns with your strengths.
Yeah. And is that where getting a life coach can be really beneficial for people if they're trying to figure that out?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because the strengths-based approach reframes the narrative for people. It's not just about your deficits and your struggles. It's actually helping you engage in what you actually are strong in, and what aligns with your own vision and mission on this earth. What are you here to do? And getting clear on that, helping people anchor into that can really help guide people towards a positive future.
Great. And I have one last question for you. And I always ask my guests this. Most of the time I try to.
Yeah.
But if you could give people one piece of advice, especially for people who have ADHD, what would that be?
Don't be so hard on yourself.
Yeah.
There's a lot of life challenges and struggles. It's not your fault. These circumstances around you weren't set up for you to thrive. And the challenges that you have within you, you're not choosing them, but you can choose how to respond to them with your self-awareness and the insights that you can reach through looking to ADHD, maybe getting a diagnosis, looking into what you need to actually thrive.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for coming on the show and sharing your insights with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's been an honor and a privilege being here. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, no worries. And for those of us who want to find out a bit more about you or your work or Deeper Potential, where can we go?
Yep. So you can go onto my website, deeperpotential.com.au. It's actually currently being revamped.
Amazing.
And you can also go onto my group program, teamadhdprogram.com, and book a call to chat with me. That's for small business owners and entrepreneurs with ADHD. I'm based in Melbourne and I'm also based in Geelong. I work at a clinic there called Create Balance. So you're welcome to find me there. And I see clients one-to-one, and I also operate in group programs as well.
Great. Well, we've also got Dan's details down in the description below. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.
You have been listening to Work in Progress, the Personal Productivity Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pp.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.